your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Hi, I'm Naveen Day. Thanks for joining us for a look at what made headlines this past week. Alberta Sheriff's Scan Unit obtained a court order to shut down a problem property in Medicine Hat Thursday morning. The order prohibits specific individuals responsible for drug and criminal activity at 48 Cameron Way from residing at the site for 2 years, with any tenant or lease agreement being terminated. The detached garage will be boarded up and fenced up until May 21st, with no one, including the owner of the house, allowed to access it. Scan will continue to monitor the site until the community safety order conditions expire in May. The property had been subjected to 18 drug and criminal complaints since April of 2023, and Scan confirmed that since October of 2024, they observed multiple instances consistent with drug activity at the property. And Lethbridge Police on Wednesday said that they have charged a 66-year-old man of sexual assault on an 11-year-old boy. Police responded to a report on February 10th at Stansiwick Pool, where it was determined that the man approached the child in the men's change room and sexually assaulted him there. The man, Kwan Phuoc Tran of Lethbridge, was arrested the next day on the 11th without incident. Tran is charged with sexual assault and sexual interference. He's been released from custody with conditions prohibiting him from accessing Stansiwick Pool and other public pools, parks, schools, playgrounds, and community centers where persons under 18 may be present. He is scheduled to appear in court on March the 25th. LPS say that after further investigation, there may be additional victims. They're asking any unidentified victims to contact police at 403-328-4444. And as recently reported on BCN, Canada witnessed a massive drop in automobile thefts in 2024 compared to previous years. However, Hamilton police in Ontario said last week they uncovered a massive auto theft ring and recovered over 200 vehicles, most that were bound to ship overseas. BCN's Landon Hickok has more details.
Hamilton police said in a news release on Wednesday they arrested 8 individuals as part of a year-long investigation known as Project Polar Bear. Over the investigation, over 200 vehicles valued at $1.5 million were recovered. As part of the theft ring, the criminals would target high-end vehicles at night to ship them domestically or internationally. Stolen vehicles that would be distributed nationally would be re-VINed, and vehicles shipped internationally were put in shipping containers destined for nations such as Iraq, Ghana, or the United Arab Emirates. Sergeant Liam Breeden of Lethbridge Police says that some of these theft operations that send vehicles internationally can and do occur in Alberta.
What we see is a lot more of those newer vehicles, whether they're taken from rental agencies or off lots and stuff like that, new car lots, like you've said, or just newer vehicles that people have just recently purchased. We have seen them. We've seen them on news, different outlets and things like that, where trackers have taken them to the UAE, to West Africa, and things like that. We do see very sophisticated methods of car theft and stuff like that. Oftentimes that's stuff that we're hearing or seeing through some of the larger hubs, larger cities and things like that, whether that's through kind of key fob cloning or basically the stealing of those signals from the fob to the vehicle.
After historic levels of vehicle thefts in Canada, the federal government enacted a National Auto Theft Action Plan in May of 2024, and since then, the numbers seem to give promising results. The years of 2022 and 2023 saw historic levels of vehicle thefts in the nation, surpassing over 70,000 incidents. In 2024, that number nosedived by 18.6% to just over 57,000 thefts. Quebec and Ontario saw the highest decreases in thefts, with significant drops of 32.4% and 17.4% respectively. Alberta now holds the highest per capita rate of thefts in Canada, even after seeing a 10% drop. Locally, Lethbridge police say that thefts remain low in the city when compared to the province's largest urban centers.
Lethbridge is a little bit of an anomaly in terms of the rest of the landscape of Alberta. From 2022 to 2024, I believe we've gone down in percentage, 24% in terms of stolen vehicles, which is a great number. And that's based on several factors and several different initiatives that we've tried to implement. Obviously, through some of our larger hubs, Calgary, Edmonton, some of those bigger centers and things like that, we're seeing more or an increase in auto thefts than we do here. more organized, things of that nature. But we are fortunate here in Lethbridge that we have seen a trend where it's gone down.
For Bridge City News, I'm Landon Hickok.
After the break, it was 3 years ago that frustrated Canadians gathered in Ottawa and in other cities to protest COVID-19 mandates. And one man was sentenced last week for his role in the Freedom Convoy. Also, we provide you with an update to the story of a plane that crashed at Toronto's Pearson Airport. All that and more is coming up next. Freedom Convoy organizer Pat King of Alberta heard his fate on Wednesday. He was handed 3 months house arrest, which includes 100 hours of community service at a food bank or men's shelter. Now, this comes on top of the 9 months he served before and during his trial. King was found guilty on 5 charges for his role in the 2022 protests that took over downtown Ottawa for several weeks. Justice Charles Hackland says King is to remain in his home, not return to Ottawa except for court appearances, and stay away from other convoy leaders. The Crown recommended to Justice Hackland that King be given 10 years in prison, the maximum sentence for mischief. King's lawyer, Natasha Calvino, says this sentence is, quote, very balanced.
The sentencing decision was very balanced. It's very respected. I respect this judge a great deal. But he struck a really good balance between what Mr. King did and what Mr. King didn't do. If Mr. King was to be sentenced to 10 years in jail, which is what the Crown was asking, they would essentially be making him a political prisoner. They would be sentencing Mr. King for the sum total of everything that was done by every individual in the Freedom Convoy. Not only did Justice Hackland find that Mr. King was nonviolent, but he specifically advocated for a lack of violence and found in his sentencing decision today that but for the very vocal actions of Mr. King, things could have been a lot worse. Was he found guilty of mischief? Absolutely. But he was not such a mischief that he should be sentenced for what everybody else did. We're not saying that things didn't happen over the course of the Freedom Convoy that was beyond our purview and that was not intended by leadership, even peripheral leadership by Mr. King. But you cannot sentence one person for the actions of others. And I think His Honor did a great balance in the balancing of the sentence. It is a jail sentence. It's equivalent to 1 year. Mr. King will spend the next 90 days, 3 months back in Alberta under house arrest, and it'd be followed by a period of probation. But this is an end to a very long and very drawn-out process, and we're happy to have it come to the conclusion. You might hate Mr. King, you may love Mr. King, but at the end of the day, that is not the role of justice. We sentence people for things that they did in line proportionally with their responsibility, and that's what we did.
But the story of the week that gained worldwide notice was that of a Delta Airlines plane that crashed at Toronto's Pearson Airport. All 21 people taken to hospital have now been released as of Thursday morning. The wreckage of that crashed plane has also been cleared from the runway and taken to a nearby hangar. The airline says removing the wreckage took several hours. Delta says it could be weeks before bags from the plane are returned to their owners because of the inspection and cleaning process. And veteran aviator and flight instructor Kit Darby analyzed the landing mishap and cited insufficient flare, which is the tipping up of the nose to decelerate. Despite the significant structural damage, the controlled deceleration of the aircraft on the runway allowed all of the passengers to survive.
To hit hard enough to damage the airplane is extremely unusual. I mean, you would be very uncomfortable and the airplane would be fine. As long as you hit on those main gear first, and it does appear to be a main gear landing, the gear is designed to take that kind of abuse. You can make no flare. It should not hurt the airplane. So after that, what happened after that, either something broke, landing gear, tire blew, or landing gear, or we banked the airplane too much and the wingtip hit the ground, or a combination of those. Our video doesn't really show the alignment like that, but it does show the right wing down, which is normal, and it explains why the right gear hits first, and also perhaps why the right wing would hit next, and it appears it did hit, and maybe pretty hard. Wings are just bolted onto the airplanes. If you hit the ground hard enough, you can break the wing off, or at least a portion of it. Well, of course, design and strength of the airplane and the seats are key, and the survivability of it. But in this case, what really hurts people is the sudden stop. So we're on a large, smooth piece of concrete. We have that initial impact, which isn't too bad, maybe enough to break the airplane, but it doesn't stop the airplane's forward motion. So it's sliding down the runway, and that's why everybody survived. We had a relatively controlled deceleration. Everybody didn't stop all at once, and they all lived, and most of them were uninjured. Crashing on an airport is, if you have to crash, it's a good place to crash.
And more tariffs could be on the horizon for Canada, now including our country's lumber exports. U.S. President Donald Trump proposed the idea of a 25% levy on lumber and forestry products on Wednesday evening. The tariff threats and Trump's talk of Canada becoming a U.S. state is not sitting well with many Canadians, as a new Leger poll suggests. More than a quarter of Canadians, 27%, view the United States as an enemy country, while another 30% still say they consider the U.S. an ally. Sébastien Dallaire, who is Leger's executive vice president for Eastern Canada, says enemy is a strong word, which is why these results are surprising.
You have almost as many people who are saying that the U.S. is an enemy as opposed to an ally, and that is something that it is in itself quite surprising. There is a partisan difference in terms of how people feel about this, where with conservative supporters being more likely to still see the U.S. as an ally. 48% of conservatives are saying that they still believe the U.S. is an ally, and that goes down to around 20% for all other parties except for the People's Party. So it's clearly a pretty big gap between conservative supporters and Liberal, NDP, and Bloc supporters.
The poll was conducted between February 14th and 17th, surveying 1,500 Canadians and 1,000 Americans. Because it was conducted online, it cannot be assigned a margin of error. And Ottawa wants to see ads banned from CBC News programming. Outgoing Heritage Minister Pascale St-Onge says she also wants to bar CBC Radio Canada from charging subscription fees for digital products such as CBC Gem. She says that in turn, the federal government would increase the public broadcaster's funding and make it more stable. St-Onge adds that the average funding for public broadcasters in G7 countries is $62 per person per year, and the CBC receives about half the G7 average. She'd like to bring it more in line with other countries. But the Canadian Taxpayers Federation doesn't think the CBC deserves more money from taxpayers. According to Franco Terrazzano of the CTF, Canada's population is about 41.5 million people, and if the government funded the CBC the way the minister is recommending, it would cost taxpayers about $2.5 billion per year, which is nearly double the current cost.
So the CBC is already costing taxpayers $1.4 billion every single year. And what the minister's proposing would mean that cost would jump up to about $2.5 billion a year, a almost $2.5 billion hit to taxpayers every single year for the CBC. You know, let's just put that huge cost into perspective, right? That amount of money would cover the grocery bill of about 150,000 families. So this government is so tone deaf. After all of the criticism Canadians have brought forward against the CBC, what's the government's plan? The government's plan is to nearly double the cost of the CBC to taxpayers.
The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is instead calling for the CBC to be completely defunded. To sum up the rest of the issues across Canada is our political correspondent, Brian Lilly. He chatted with BCN's Jeanette Rocher about Mark Carney. He's a Liberal leadership candidate recently under scrutiny for doublespeak. In a Kelowna rally, he talked about the potential of using emergency powers to build major projects like pipelines. But then in an interview with French-speaking media, he said the complete opposite.
He definitely is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So in Kelowna, it was all about build, build, build. Energy infrastructure is important. We have to get it done, even if that means using the emergency powers of the federal government to do that. A lot of people thought he was talking about using the Emergencies Act for whatever reason. No, there are different powers the federal government has, including ones that could allow them to expedite building pipelines. But then he does an interview in French, and he's asked, well, would you put this in against like an east-west pipeline against the wishes of Quebec? No. Well, never, he says. And he's asked time and again, would provinces have veto over pipeline projects? And he said, yes, and I would never impose one upon Quebec. So two very different messages. And look, there was a time when politicians, to a degree, could get away with saying one thing in English and one thing in French because, well, not enough people are speaking both languages or we're not paying attention.
I was going to say, it pays to be bilingual these days, especially, right?
And we've got the interwebs where people share things, and so I mean, there's already video going around that combines Carney in Kelowna with Carney on CBC in French. It's very damaging to him. It really makes him look like he's not being forthright. But look, this is a guy who also said he would balance the budget within 3 years. Well, he's talking about massively increasing defense spending, infrastructure projects, but also keeping all of the liberal social programs that they're just starting, like dental, which is going to get more expensive by the year. And then it turns out, well, no, he's not really going to balance the budget. He's going to split the budget in two, and all the deficit stuff will be over here in the capital budget, but the operating budget, he will balance. That's not telling the truth. You're trying to go around things, just like his carbon tax. So this is probably, I'd say, the third time. He said he'd get rid of the consumer carbon tax, but then he would dramatically increase the industrial carbon tax, and he wants to put a carbon tariff on imports from outside of the country. Well, you're essentially making us pay more for imported goods, which is another way of saying a carbon tax. So Mark Carney isn't exactly being truthful or forthright with voters, and there's a very good chance that, where are we now? February 18th, and just over 2 weeks, he will become prime minister.
Oh my goodness. Okay. And then we've got a recent poll now showing a majority across Canada supporting projects like the Energy East pipeline. So does that support extend into Quebec?
It is about 76, 77% across the country say, yeah, they support that project now. And that's about the level of support even in Alberta, surprisingly enough. Support in Alberta is down. And I have to wonder, is that because some people are just pessimistic about it now and say, well, it'll never happen? But in Quebec, support was up from the low to mid 30s back in 2019, but only up to 47%. So not quite half yet. Quebec is still not on board pipelines. Sure, they want the revenue from the transfer payments, equalization. They want the benefits of an economy that is supported by the oil and gas sector in so many ways, but they don't want pipelines. There's already pipelines in Quebec. They are just very hypocritical, and a lot of it driven by media outlets like what we saw, badgering politicians not to support anything that comes from Alberta.
Okay, Brian, last week when we spoke, you were in Washington, D.C. following the premier's round, and there have been critics of the trip saying that they didn't accomplish anything, even comparing their meeting at the White House to a meeting with the kitchen intern. But you were there, Brian, and you take a different view, a different approach, and say that the trip was worth it. So why do you say that?
Well, first off, just the number of meetings that they had were fantastic. So individually, each premier was off meeting people that were important to them. Premier Danielle Smith meeting with Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, who is very important when it comes to the oil and gas industry. Things like if they were to bring back a Keystone XL pipeline, he'd be a key driver of that. He'd be an influencer. People like Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota. He shares a border with Saskatchewan and Manitoba. He met with all the premiers, but also individually met with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Saskatchewan Scott Moe met with Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, one of the leaders of the GOP. So, you're making these connections, you're making Canada's case, and you can run down the list of, I believe that Premiers Moe and Smith had joint meetings at times with people who are on the Energy Committee. Those meetings matter. The personal connection matters. And I've been saying this for a while now. It is of greater importance in Washington, D.C. than in Ottawa. It's of greater importance than in Toronto. I don't do business in Calgary quite like I used to, so I can't say there. But they put an incredible emphasis on that one-on-one meeting. And I think, I was about to call him Senator, Premier Wab Kinew of Manitoba, he put it this way. He said, this is a charm offensive, and it's about shaking the hand, looking someone in the eye, smiling at them, and making a connection. On the White House meeting, I couldn't believe how dismissive some people were. And if you think that meeting with James Blair, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff to the President, and Sergio Gore, who's in charge of his personnel, if you think that's the kitchen intern, then you know nothing about Trump's world, okay? Look, a group of business leaders was also down with the premiers, and some of them met with Kevin Haslett, one of Trump's key economic advisors. That was a great meeting for them to get over at the White House. James Blair is a different cat. Is he a cabinet secretary? No. He's the guy in charge of legislation and policy for the White House. That's his job. He was also key in Trump's winning campaign, reaching out to people that don't normally vote and getting them out to the polls. Sergio Gore is one of the tightest people with Trump. Those were the two people. They were originally only supposed to meet Blair, and Gore dropped by and sat in on the meeting. It went well until David Eby of British Columbia made some stupid comments outside and saw Blair take to social media. That wasn't a good outcome, but the rest of the meeting, I'm told, was good. And they've been invited back for future meetings with people like Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick once he's actually confirmed.
Okay, because there was so much talk about the border issue, and Brian, you've said that fentanyl came up over and over again with the Americans, but the Canadian government is saying that less than 1% of fentanyl in the U.S. comes from Canada. So why do the Americans see things so differently?
Well, one, they don't believe that we're prosecuting people properly. They don't believe that we are catching or that they're catching the fentanyl that's going across. In fact, just as we were leaving or just after we left, there was a bust at a shipping facility in Seattle. A pound of fentanyl, which is a lot of fentanyl. That can kill an awful lot of people. It was found, it had been shipped down in a package from Canada. And while they were doing spot checks, they found it. We need to take the fentanyl issue seriously so that our border doesn't become thickened the way it is elsewhere, right? Our two-way trade requires us to be able to move goods quickly and speedily. It doesn't take a long time to get across the US border from Canada, and we want to keep it that way. So people keep saying to me, but it's up to the Americans to find this stuff. Well, you could argue that, or you could argue we need to find it before it leaves, before it heads down there, because otherwise that border will get thick. That truck will take a long time to cross over. You will take a long time to cross over, driving down to see family or friends or do shopping or go on a vacation, what have you. We don't want that border to get thick. And they believe that it is coming through the mail, that trucking firms are now moving an awful lot of this in connection with cartels and triads, and they want it stopped. So it's not helpful. And I was told time and again, every business leader told me it came up in the meeting. The politicians told me it came up in the meetings. And the federal government downplaying this, even as they appointed a fentanyl czar, that does not go over well. The fact that we did appoint a fentanyl czar, that did go over well. But trying to downplay it, is I keep saying that this relationship is like a marriage. Well, if one partner in the marriage says there's a problem and the other person just keeps saying, no, there isn't, you're going to end up in an argument.
Yeah,
so
there is a problem, obviously.
Yeah, listen and respond. Don't just say there's no problem over and over again.
For the first time, the Alberta government publicly addressed a lawsuit and allegations against the government concerning high-level government corruption surrounding medical contracts. In response, Premier Danielle Smith says she's making some changes by appointing Darren Headley as Alberta's Deputy Minister of Health. Andre Tremblay will continue as the interim CEO and official administrator of Alberta Health Services. This comes on the heels of former AHS CEO Athana Mentzelopoulos' allegations of sketchy deals pushed by Alberta officials.
To deal with surgical backlogs, Alberta Health Services followed the strategic direction provided by previous governments, signed contracts with charter surgical facilities to help alleviate pressure on our health system and increase capacity. And because it has worked, we tried to expand these centres through new competitive bid processes. In terms of the latest RFP process for new facilities, the former CEO of Alberta Health Services made some very troubling allegations, and those allegations are serious and they are being investigated. We have asked the Auditor General to expedite his review so that we can have answers as soon as possible.
Last week, the former CEO of AHS filed a statement of claim. Upon review, the allegations and claims that have been made against me are false, while others will have to be investigated further as part of the Auditor General's work and the government's external third-party investigation that is being set up by Deputy Minister McPherson. We will be filing our statement of defense in the coming weeks and will be vigorously, and I mean vigorously, defending against this claim.
In her defense, Mentzelopoulos made 77 claims in her statement of facts. She is seeking compensation in the amount of $1.7 million. On January 8th, she was stripped of her role via a Zoom call, and she is suing the province for wrongful dismissal, claiming she was let go for investigating overpriced contracts. Meanwhile, Alberta's opposition NDP has been very vocal about the issue, even calling the alleged scandal corrupt care. Edmonton Glenora MLA Sarah Hoffman is the Shadow Minister of Health. She is calling on the province to put a stop to privatized health care.
The severity of these allegations of corruption and interference when dealing with surgical contracts in our healthcare system is a major concern for Albertans, especially for those who are still waiting for surgeries. We know that our public healthcare needs investment. And when Danielle Smith was running for leader, she promised that she'd fix healthcare in 90 days. Well, she's been premier for 852, and she's only made it worse. Next week, the legislature will finally return, and the UCP will have to table a budget. Albertans deserve a meaningful investment in public healthcare. But what we've seen under the UCP is a desire to Americanize and privatize our healthcare system. Let's be clear, nobody wants this privatization of our healthcare system.
The threat of tariffs on Canadian goods imported to the United States is on many Canadians' minds. But how do tariffs work, and how do they affect our bottom line? After the break, an economics professor from the University of Lethbridge unpacks it all. And if you're watching us online, that full interview is available on our YouTube channel.